Imagine this. One day you're a noblewoman, respected, safe. The next, your city is burning, and the only silence is the sound of your own fear. Your husband is gone. For the soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, the fight ended in victory and plunder. But for their wives and daughters, the real terror was just starting. The moment the battle was won, the women didn't just become prisoners, they became commodities. The Ottomans weren't just chaotic raiders. They had built a meticulous, terrifying system where the identity of every woman captured in war was immediately stripped away and replaced with a price tag. It wasn't random looting. It was law, organized, written down, and built right into the core of their vast empire. Before we dive into the chilling details of this system, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next descent into history's darkest corners. These captives were known in the empire's legal terms as sabaya, or spoils of war, and the Ottomans applied this rule with ruthless efficiency. The process of dehumanization started instantly. Specialized officers stormed conquered cities, separating people with cold, precise calculation. Men, women, and children were split apart like livestock. The wives of the defeated, many still in shock, were forced into a degrading inspection. Ottoman doctors and officials treated them like products on an assembly line. They checked their teeth, prodded their bodies, and, most cruelly, calculated their ability to bear children. Their youth, their beauty, and their health decided their price. A young woman with striking features was instantly marked for Constantinople, the capital. Older captives were condemned to backbreaking labor or simply thrown into obscurity. This was an industry of humiliation. A woman who once commanded respect was handled like an animal. Her body was examined right there on the streets, her value shouted out for everyone to hear. The nightmare only deepened on the journey. Long columns of captives, often chained together, were forced to march for weeks through dirt and heat. Many collapsed from hunger or exhaustion and were left to die on the roadside. Others were crammed into wagons, treated like nothing more than sacks of grain. Just reaching the market alive was an act of brutal survival. But what waited at the end was worse. The slave markets of the Ottoman world weren't some secret, dark alleyways. They were official, government-run institutions, regulated and taxed by the state itself. In major cities, women were lined up for close inspection by potential buyers. Buyers had the right to touch, examine, and test them before making an offer. A woman's skills, sewing, cooking, weaving, were put on display like tools at a hardware stall. If she failed to impress, she could be beaten or her price was simply dropped. Dignity was gone. Humiliation was the entire point. They were forced to maintain a fake smile, show instant obedience, and act as if they had already accepted their new life. Behind the buyers, scribes meticulously wrote everything down: names, origins, ages, and final selling prices. These ledgers of misery filled the Ottoman archives. The most beautiful captives were often sent to the darkest destination of all, the empire's harem. Forget the romantic myths of silk and forbidden love. The harem was a prison, a gilded cage wrapped in gold. Inside Topkapi Palace, thousands of women from every conquered land were held under lock and key, competing for survival under the constant watch of guards. Their identity was completely erased. Language, faith, even their birth names were stripped away. A Christian woman from Greece or Hungary would wake up and be renamed, forced to speak Turkish, and forced to adopt Islamic rituals. Refusal meant terrible punishment: starvation, whipping, or being locked in dark, isolation cells. The harem wasn't just about abuse, it was about psychological destruction. These women fought desperately for any scrap of influence, knowing that favor from a powerful figure meant protection, while rejection meant violence or death. Many never adapted. Some went mad. Others took their own lives. It was not paradise. It was an identity graveyard. The system didn't stop at enslavement, it weaponized the future. Captive women were forced to produce the next generation of slaves. Any child born to an enslaved mother was automatically the master's property. Mothers were forced to raise children they could never truly claim as their own, knowing the empire could rip them away at any moment. The womb itself became a tool of exploitation. Even religion was turned against them. Forced conversions were not about faith. They were about complete domination. To refuse meant torture. To accept meant the final, complete severing of all ties to their family, culture, and past. Conversion made escape useless. Even if a woman ran, she had been erased legally and spiritually. This is how the Ottomans turned a temporary military victory into permanent generational control. The battle lasted weeks, but the women's fate stretched for centuries. Their bodies became an extension of imperial power. Their children were born into chains. Their identities were systematically wiped out. The empire turned horror into paperwork, proving that no rank, no nobility, and no bloodline could resist its power. Survivors came home, but they felt like strangers. They were living proof of the absolute destruction the conquest had brought. For centuries, historians only talked about Ottoman glory, their amazing architecture, and their vast power. They ignored the receipts of human suffering, the ledgers filled with the names and prices of women whose voices were buried under the myths of a grand empire. What made this system so terrifying was how organized it was. This was not chaos. It was a structured machine of enslavement, designed to run smoothly for generation after generation. Women became units of value, their misery approved by law and their exploitation given a ceremonial blessing. The Ottoman methods were copied by other empires, creating a blueprint for controlled slavery and forced conversion that lasted for centuries. This was a lesson in how a state can erase humanity while pretending to be civilized. Cannons knocked down walls, but paperwork destroyed people's lives. The conquest never truly ended when the battle was won. It lived on in those ledgers, in those harems, and in generations of enslaved children. But there was one final, chilling layer. The Ottoman system of enslavement was not always the worst fate. For some, the punishment was designed purely for spectacle. When cities resisted or commanders defied the Sultan, their wives were singled out. The empire turned them into living warnings. Punishment began with public exposure. Captured women were dragged through the streets, beaten, and displayed before their own conquered communities. Their humiliation wasn't private. It was policy. A noble commander's wife might be stripped and paraded before the very people who had watched her husband fall. Her body became a banner of defeat. They used hot irons to brand their skin, not to mark them as property, but to burn away their dignity. Noblewomen were forced to clean the floors of barracks. Wives of leaders were made to serve wine to the officers who butchered their families. And the cruelty escalated. Some were deliberately placed in positions where death was slow and public, locked in iron cages or hung from city gates, left to starve in sight of their own people. The darkest act was reserved for women who bore children of defeated leaders. The Ottomans feared bloodlines. They feared a son might one day rise to reclaim his father's name. So they cut the lineage at its root. Infants were ripped from their mothers, sold off, or executed right there. A mother forced to watch the killing of her child understood immediately. The empire would not allow even the shadow of resistance to survive. Torture was methodical. Officers employed psychological warfare, forcing women to choose which child would be spared and which would die, shattering their loyalty forever. Others were kept alive only long enough to witness the execution of family members. And all of this was written down. The Ottomans documented horror like accountants tallying profits. But the most terrifying punishment was just disappearing. Some women were erased not by death, not by torture, but by complete silence. They were taken into secret chambers, confined for years, allowed no contact with the outside world. They became ghosts, swallowed by the empire's machinery. The cruelty worked. Fear traveled faster than armies. Cities surrendered not because the walls collapsed, but because word spread of what awaited the women inside. This was conquered by terror. The empire proved that absolute domination could be dressed up as law, setting a terrifying precedent that echoed for centuries. And this is why the story of what the Ottomans did to the wives of defeated warriors still echoes. Not because of how they lived, but because of how completely they were erased. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from.